We were young until we weren't, but the books stay the same. Rereading our favorite books.
Another big issue with the realism thing is that Katniss is excluded from all of the planning going on or any of the behind the scenes stuff. The book constantly reminds us that Katniss doesn't know what's going on in the war. She is not being given that information by anybody. She is being excluded from meetings. She doesn't know a lot. So that's like why District 2 is so refreshing, because she actually sees like people talking about the war effort. But it's a missed opportunity. Yeah, sure, it's probably not realistic to have a 17-year-old involved in war strategy, but she absolutely needs to be there, if only so she can see and interact with Coin. Because that's another of my huge problems with this book, is that at least for two of the essential characters in this book, Katniss and Coin, nothing really dynamic happens with them. There isn't really much of a character arc for either. Katniss is despondent and lethargic and out of it and depressed at the beginning of the book, and she is despondent and lethargic and out of it and depressed at the end of the book. Nothing changes with her character. And it's the same way with Coin. Like, imagine if we had seen a more charismatic Coin at the start, where she is saying all the right things. She seems like a good leader, but slowly over the course of the narrative, we see more and more of Coin's agenda, and we start to doubt more and more about her intentions, and we can slowly establish that maybe this rebellion, certainly overthrowing the capital, is a good thing, but if Coin is the one replacing Snow, has progress actually been made? And there could have been something really compelling with that twist at the end. I hate to say it, but if this was more of a twist, it actually would have been better for the book.
What a twist!
We already have doubts about Coin, but the problem is the book hasn't earned that. It feels like a false equivalence, because we're being told that, like, there's lines early on in the book that say, like, District 13 is just as controlling as the capital. Coin is just as ambitious, blah, blah, blah. And things like that that are told to us, but absolutely not earned. And it reads like both sides nonsense. Like, we're just supposed to believe that Coin is just as bad as Snow without establishing any reason why within this narrative, without even establishing her character. It's like when she dies at the end, that should be a moment of like both triumph and horror. But the way I felt, it's just like, oh, she's dead now.
Yeah, I think that, speaking of twists, like, I agree with you. There needs to be more buildup of District 13 as this questionable force. And therefore Coin at its head is a questionable force. But you don't get quite enough for the ending to fully work. Like, I will say I do like it. I just think there are things that could be done to make it more effective. So, for instance, I think, speaking of Katniss being dumbed down, to be fair, she's in shock. Like, I want to give her that credit. She's in shock. Katniss heard about the double exploding bombs. As much as I love Snow on page, and he's always a dynamic character to read, I don't think she should have had that conversation with President Snow.
Yeah.
I think that question about the bomb should have been lurking in the back of her head, and then when Coin comes in and suggests the Hunger Games, that's like when she's like, she knows that the bombs were 13s, like, for sure, and she makes that call. Because I do think that we see when she votes yes on the Hunger Games, she's doing it not because she actually wants them to happen, but because she's planning to kill Coin. She's saying yes so there's no fuss so that she can kill Coin. But I feel like because she's essentially been told the bombs weren't it doesn't quite work. Snow tells her the bombs weren't his, and she's like, to be fair, she does try and go get an answer from Haymitch, and he is not helpful. But I just feel like there could have been a better twist, a better build, if there's not that conversation with Snow. If she if it's lurking in the back of her head, and that conversation about having another Hunger Games is what really just makes it all click for her. And I think it's stronger that way.
Speaking of lack of build-up, I also want to say, I know this might be contentious with you, but I felt like Prim's character in this book, really this entire series, has been just a huge missed opportunity. What's really frustrating to me is that we never have a scene where Prim and Katniss talk about the fact that Katniss volunteered for her. That could have been this huge character moment for both of them where, you could choose all sorts of directions you could go with it. It could be Prim being grateful and really discussing that and having a heart-to-heart that forces Katniss to open up and be vulnerable for at least one moment. You could have Prim being angry because she feels indebted to her sister, this huge debt that she could never repay, this feeling of guilt that her sister almost died and almost had to die twice, and it's now the Mockingjay. All this bad that's happened to Katniss is because Katniss volunteered for Prim. And just the sense of guilt that can come out of that, and how that guilt can turn into anger. There are many, many different directions you could have taken this, but it felt like you needed something more in that relationship beyond the fact that they're just sisters and that Prim is the perfectest, most wonderful human being alive. There needs to be more to her character than that for me to care that she dies at the end. Because again, it feels like I'm not sad that Prim died. I'm supposed to be sad because Katniss is sad.
Yeah. I will say, at least for this book, I think they have some conversations. I mean, they have actual conversations. We don't get to see Prim and Katniss really have conversations before this book. So I'm at least we have conversations between them. And we get to see, Prim's wants to become a doctor, etc. But I think one of the solutions, if Suzanne didn't want to bring Peeta back until halfway through, for whatever reason, why isn't maybe Prim is sticking with her sister because Katniss is in poor shape? Maybe Prim is the one sticking with her and is therefore present for some of these discussions, and Prim can be the one being let's not do double exploding bombs. And then the irony, when she's killed by them, would have been,
Indeed.
There are things that could have been done with Prim that would have made her more present. I think the problem with Prim, and it's always been the problem with Prim, which I didn't bring up originally when we were talking about book 1, is Prim has always been a Walking Dead girl. The character was so clearly gonna die from the beginning. There's just no way. It's the same way that, Rue was clearly gonna die.
Yeah.
They are just Walking Dead girls because they are representing a certain innocence, a certain whatever. And so they have to, again, everything is standing for something. Suzanne is not subtle. Prim was gonna die. There was no way Prim wasn't gonna die. So I feel on the one hand, would it have been good to have Prim more present in the book? Yes. On the other hand, she's so clearly gonna die that I feel I would have the same problem with her that I had watching Rogue One, which is that I was watching Rogue One and I was if I wasn't spoiled. I just knew they were all gonna die because it's gonna die because it's a prequel and no one's surviving that shit. So how do you get invested in the characters in their journey if you know that they're all just gonna die in that? I'm not saying it can't be done. There's absolutely characters I've gotten invested in knowing they were going to die. But I'm not sure Suzanne could have pulled it off. So I'm very torn about Prim. Because I both agree with you, but I'm also would I want to wasted time getting to know Prim without me being able to get invested in her?
I think it's not so much that you're just getting to know her. She's also offering Because I love your idea of using Prim as the PETA stand-in, because one, that would avoid the stupid love triangle of like one alpha male going up to another alpha male and fighting for the girl. We could have avoided that. But it would also have allowed Prim to have a more vital role in being a part of the debate. Would have made her character so much more functional and so much more meaningful. So that even if we don't necessarily it's not like I need to feel like her friend, but the fact that if she's bringing up points that I agree with, or at least challenging it'll just be sad to see her go for that reason at the very least. It would have been something rather than just as this obvious manipulative nonsense to be like, here is a major character who is so innocent and wonderful, and she has been murdered by the Capitol. Psych. It was coin. That's the problem when you can't write subtlety, is that everything is just so obnoxiously obvious about what Collins is trying to do that you just die inside. Like, oh my god. I don't know if you remember this, but there's a scene where it's when they're hunkering down in District 13 after the attack by the Capitol, and Katniss is playing with the cat, and she's using like a laser pointer or whatever to make the cat chase after it, and the book is writing it like Katniss invented that game, which is baffling. And then we have this embarrassing passage. One of the most embarrassing things I've ever read. Katniss is playing this game with the cat. People are watching, and she has this quote-unquote revelation. And I'll just read it out loud for everybody. It's on the third night during our game that I answer the question eating away at me. Crazy Cat, which is the name she gave to the game, becomes a metaphor for my situation. I am Buttercup, the cat. PETA, the thing I want so badly to secure, is the light. As long as Buttercup feels he has the chance of catching the elusive light under his paws, he's bristling with aggression. That's how I've been since I left the arena, with PETA alive. When the light goes out completely, Buttercup's temporarily distraught and confused, but he recovers and moves on to other things. That's what would happen if PETA died. But the one thing that sends Buttercup into a tailspin is when I leave the light on, but put it hopelessly out of his reach, high on the wall, beyond even his jumping skills. He paces below the wall, wails, and can't be comforted or distracted. He's useless until I shut the light off. That's what Snow is trying to do to me now, only I don't know what form his game takes. Morgan, when I write a book, if I try to make some strained metaphor like this, please just hit me. Do not let me publish this. This is so bad. And it's like, I don't know if it's just like Collins feels she can't trust the reader to understand what's going on, or if she's just lost herself about what she wants things to represent, so she has to like I mean, I
don't mind the actual metaphor itself, but yes, the fact that she spells it out that deliberately is annoying. She could have just had Katniss playing the Crazy Cat game and like put the laser up on the wall where Buttercup can't reach it and just have her kind of watching that. I feel like you can have the metaphor without having to like say it's a metaphor, you know? That's the thing that people do sometimes. Yeah, no, there are definitely a few times in this book where like Suzanne just really spells a thing out for you and you're like, you didn't have to, Suzanne. It's okay. But I mean, I think that is, we must just accept that is Suzanne. Like it is, and it's okay if it is not your thing. Like I would say that like the writing in these books does not inspire me greatly. I'm much more driven by the ideas in this these books clearly than I am by the actual mechanical writing, the actual prose.
I guess that's where this book loses me because, The Hunger Games, the first book was okay, in my opinion. Had some interesting ideas, but overall just okay. I loved the second book because I thought the ideas were really, really cool. In this book, there's just this kind of empty cynicism that's really just uninteresting. It kind of reads like the way teenagers can be like, yeah, nothing matters. We're all going to die anyway. Life sucks. And often we don't really actually believe that, because if we actually believed that, then there'd be no reason to continue living. It's frustrating because that point feels... If empty cynicism was at the heart of this trilogy, that would be one thing. It would be unpleasant to read, and I don't think anyone would care about the book series if that was the case. But it just feels so contrary to what the book is about, because everything the Capitol has done up to this point is about manufacturing that cynicism. No matter what happens, you can't do anything about it. People are going to suffer and die. We will have power over you. You can't change that. And so much of the rebellion at the heart of this trilogy is fighting back against that idea that there isn't anything you can do. Because there is. Katniss finds a way to break the game, to break the rules and not play by the game. That is part of what makes her character inspiring to the other districts, to the readers, to everybody involved. At this point, to have her sidelined and to have her saying things that, this doesn't matter, and to make her completely inactive in her own story, I don't agree with that idea. I don't agree with that premise, I guess, of what Collins is trying to say here, because it just feels doesn't feel true to this book series. Maybe it's quote unquote realistic. Maybe nothing changes no matter what you do. I also don't think that's true, but that's the kind of truth that's being presented here, and it's just really bleak and boring to read. So with the second book, I could get over the facts that the writing isn't the greatest. That's fine, because the ideas were cool and interesting. And I'm not saying that the ideas in the second book were complete super optimistic. They're not. But there's an allowance for people to resist. And resistance when you think that nothing matters doesn't really make sense to me. And that's kind of where the ending really falls flat to me, because it just feels like this kind of well, we have to end, specifically when there's the epilogue where we learn that she has 2 children after spending 2.5 books talking about how she probably doesn't want children. That gets completely flipped over in a matter of 2 pages. But it just feels like this kind of tacked on, well, the book has been too bleak, so we need something optimistic. Children are optimistic. The children are our future. It just feels like it's completely missing the point of the entire series.
So, I think that I do really like the ideas I think Suzanne was trying to present here, which is that I think that she was trying to kind of deconstruct the rebels are the good guys, the Capitol is just this monolithic evil force. I think she was trying to add nuance to that in this book. And be okay, so you've seen how evil the Capitol is. You've also seen that there are good people in the Capitol, that there's more going on. I feel book 2, we talked a lot about, we are able to see, one, how they're blind to their own privilege, but also still have, empathy for them in this moment and see that, the mechanism of the Capitol is hurting everyone in certain ways, etc. So then we go into this book, and I feel she's trying to be okay, but, just because they're fighting against the Capitol doesn't mean this side is good. And I think it is a lot more about being stuck between two forces that are ultimately working for their own good, but they're trying to say, like, I feel like District 13 is meant to be like, oh yes, they say they're helping, but really it's for their own advancement, their own good. They're just like, they're giving the liberal talking points, you know? They're like, yeah, district rights. But in actuality, it's District 13 rights. I feel like that's what Suzanne's trying to do with this. And I like that message being in there. I think that what it needs is it needs more of the moments like when Katniss is talking to the man with the gun where she's like, we're stuck between two forces that want, like, this is what they want from us, to be turned against each other. This is, you know, and that applies to District 13 too, because they want the districts turned against the Capitol. They don't want them to have empathy for the Capitol. They want the districts to then essentially become the Capitol with creating the next Hunger Games, right? So we needed more moments of like small resistance of like, okay, we are people stuck between two large forces that are ultimately only like going for their own good. How do we do the right thing stuck between these forces? How do we on a small scale do good? Because I feel like that's the realistic message that should be put forth. And I feel like that's supposedly kind of what is being represented by, because there's definitely like both sides are bad. I feel like we established that both sides are bad. But if we needed more of like, you're right, a somewhat optimistic, or not even optimistic, but like I feel like almost like the Good Place message of like, you know, there is no ethical consumerism under capitalism, but like you can try your best and you should be rewarded for trying your best and under a system in which you cannot be ethical. So I feel like we needed something of the same message of like, there is no good answer. We can only choose the answer that is most right for us in this moment, which I feel like Katniss could give us because, as you said, like, look, her and Peeta potentially committing suicide by berries was not the best answer, but it was the best answer they could give in that moment. It was the most ethical answer for her in that moment, you know? So I feel like, yes, we needed more moments of Katniss being able to make those choices. And to be fair, I do think the choice in the end is sort of that choice. She's like, to break down her thought process that we never get, but I assume happens, she's like, Snow will definitely die regardless. No one is putting Snow back in power, but we also cannot have Coin in power. Like, we need to destabilize this system in order to have a more equitable system. And that means eliminating both of, like, the heads of the sides so that there's a power vacuum that, like, will hopefully create a better result. So I do feel like that moment is that, but because we don't get the right build up to it, because we're not seeing more of these choices, and because we don't, unfortunately, Suzanne, for once, was maybe too subtle. Or at least she didn't build towards it the way that I think it needed to be built towards. Then, to touch on your other point about the reproductive futurism, which I brought up in the last book, of course, thinking forward to this, but you did not know about that when I was bringing it up then. So, I think there's something, unfortunately, very heteronormative reproductive futurism about this entire series. I do kind of end up liking it, sort of. Not really.
What's going on with you? What are you talking about? You sound insane.
I'm very torn. I think part of the problem is I think it's a little bit, because they're also like, yes, Annie had a baby, so therefore Finnick carries on. I'm like, I'm sorry, if you killed Finnick, just kill Finnick. Like, have the guts to just kill him and she doesn't get a baby. That's one too many babies. I do like the idea of Katniss sitting in this meadow with her kids. And I will push back. I feel like what we've seen in previous books is Katniss doesn't know how she feels about children because she can't see herself ethically justifying having children. So I feel like her having children is also supposed to represent that, like, she at this point feels comfortable bringing them into this world. As someone who has historically been mad about having characters having children after saying they don't want children, cough, cough, Bella Swan, I feel somewhat more comfortable with this decision to have her reproduce. And I like the image of her in the meadow with her children who are playing on the mass grave of all the people who died in District 12 and trying to think about how she's going to talk to her children about everything that happened, how she's going to explain to them this world. Like, I don't mind that because I do think it's like the message of how do we teach people so they learn from our mistakes? How do we, like... tell our children about the horrors that we have been a part of or that our culture has been a part of, etc. Like, I don't think these are bad questions to ask at the end of this book, and to like leave you with how, because especially if there was more of a push on like how to be an ethical person, how to like make these best choices in between two horrible forces, I feel like, again, like it's like, how do you then teach your children to do that? Like, I don't mind that question. I just think that, yeah, it is kind of a cliche to be like, ah, yes, and then they had babies, and yes, as you said, the children are the future. I mean, I will say that I do like that it's not like a, ah, yes, and my children are totally happy, blah, blah, blah. It's a very eerie image. They're playing it on a mass grave. That's creepy. So, like, it does present a somewhat, like, Harry Potter epilogue. And I feel like, again, if the theme of this book, I think, had been more not subtle, then the epilogue could have tied in better and would have felt more earned.
Yeah, it just feels like so much of this book is not earned. Like the whole one. Oh, hold on. Sirens. When Coin introduces the idea of doing one last Hunger Games, the way it's presented is that, oh no, nothing has changed, nothing will ever change, blah, blah, blah. On the one hand, like, for me, it just doesn't practically work because I feel like the idea of introducing the Hunger Games in this moment would immediately turn like half of the population against you and start another civil war almost immediately. It's politically nonsensical. That's the kind of the moment where it's like we're being presented this quote-unquote realistic story, and then we have these ridiculous moments that could only happen if you're going after big thematic ideas, or if you just want to include lizard people in your book. But it just doesn't, you can't have both. So it's like that.
Wait, I want to argue against this. I think it's very realistic.
I feel like it doesn't make sense in this moment for Coin to be like, no, let's have another Hunger Games. I mean, BT immediately calls it out like, no, this is a moment of unity. We need to come together. The implication being, you're going to piss off a ton of people.
I mean, unfortunately, I do think it's realistic because I think that, like, you're saying, oh, people from the districts will see it and they'll be like, oh no, not the Hunger Games again. But I feel like, unfortunately, it is very human nature-y, especially when you've been fed a very much us versus them mentality, to dehumanize the other side and be like, oh, yeah, you made us go through the Hunger Games for 75 years? Time for you to have a Hunger Games. Like, time for your children to suffer and to want to visit that retribution onto the other side. I'm sorry, like, how many wars have we had where we're able to, like, people are completely dehumanizing the people on the other side and being like, these people deserve to be bombed, these people deserve to be raped, these people deserve to be tortured. Like, I just don't think, like, the amount of public support that we have seen historically for wars, which, like, yes, thank goodness there's been less public support recently, but, like, the Capitol has made them miserable. And we see throughout from various people how much they loathe the Capitol people. And I think realistically, quite the same people are very still angry at the Capitol. They want more retribution visited upon the Capitol. They've suffered for 75 years. I think it's pretty realistic. Like, I'm not saying there would still be people, of course, who would be, like, appalled. There are the PETAs of the world. But I feel like we can't look at the people who actually lived through the Hunger Games and take their reactions as representative of the masses. Because the masses have only seen, like, these people live lives of extreme privilege while their own children have been taken away and forced to fight to the death for their amusement. I'm sorry, I think it's human nature to, like, a lot of people would be like, yeah, your kids should.
I'm not saying that the feeling is unrealistic. I'm saying that as a political decision, it's baffling. We're told that Coin is a shrewd, ambitious person, and this decision to have another Hunger Games is incredibly short-sighted for all sorts of different reasons. I mean, because you are instantly going to antagonize a huge portion of the population that you now want to rule. This country is in shambles at the moment. Like, I think I'm not like a history person. I'm not an expert on this, but I think to like the American Civil War and how at the end of that Civil War, Abraham Lincoln pardons the entire South. And it was a decision to bring the country back together and to move forward together and rebuild together because the country was in shambles at that point. And if this sort of like legal antagonism, political antagonism was allowed to continue thriving, then the country would just fall back into one war after another, after another, after another, and there would be nothing to build upon. Coin would be like the shortest tenured leader in the history of Panem. So as a political decision, it's just dumb because not only are you going to be turning portions of the population against you, you're going to be turning some of the victors against you. And we've been told, the book tells us that Katniss's opinion has sway. So if Katniss comes out and says like, Coin wants to institute the Hunger Games, she is a fucking idiot and we're not going to allow that to happen. That is going to be immensely influential to a lot of people who will now suddenly turn against Coin and be like, you Coin. They're just the idea of like giving in to people who want more as a way of consolidating power is nonsensical to me, because if anything, it would unsettle that power even more so than it already is.
I understand the point you're making, and I agree that in the long term, I don't think it would have been the right choice. But to use the example that you yourself brought up, there was quite heavy opposition against how light the South got off after the Civil War from more radical parties. So I think that, I mean, quite frankly, regardless of what decision Coin made, she would have been alienating a certain portion of the population. And so I think what we learned is that a lot of the districts have a much higher population than the capital. The capital is like literally the 1%. And so I think for her, like, I think she's looking at it and being like, the people are still angry. They feel like they haven't like gotten their own back, essentially. We'll have one last Hunger Games. We'll settle this. And then we can move forward, you know. And obviously this wouldn't be popular with the capital, wouldn't be popular with some people. It would be very popular with certain groups who would want that revisited back upon them. So I don't think it is, as you said, just the politically, and she does say, she makes a point of saying that like it will be made known, not necessarily who voted for what, but that like the tribute supported this decision. So I think that also moves some of the onus off of her, and I think that's savvy of her. I just don't think it's as clear cut as you think. Like, yes, there are ways to unify. There are multiple ways to unify. One is the unification of like, let's just move forward as one nation, blah, blah, blah. But there's also the way of unifying that's like, we as the districts need to stay unified as we're creating this new version of Panem. So let's make sure we stay unified by letting everyone get their own back against the capital. Let's make sure everyone is satisfied that this is still our enemy, that we are all united against this enemy. So I think that, unfortunately, I do think it is a realistic decision to be made. And I will say, like, long term, obviously, you have like an entire, essentially, if we're thinking of the capital as a district, like an entire district who is anti-you. And surely all the moderates in the actual districts. But depending on your aims, I do think there's political worth in making that choice. I can't believe I'm arguing for this. But I think it's realistic. And I think it's something Coin would do.
This is my problem, because obviously the Hunger Games it's a very loaded term at this point within this world. So the idea of presenting now we're going to do the Hunger Games against you, that's inherently going to antagonize a lot of people. But if we had Coin coming in and saying like, hey, we're going to like send the capital people into concentration camps or something like it, maybe not as obvious as that, but something like we are going to turn the citizens of the capital, basically subjugate them now ourselves. If you had some kind of different plan where then Katniss can come in and be like, this really isn't that different from the Hunger Games, what they're proposing here. It's two sides of the same coin. I know what you're trying to do, Collins, with the name. You're not shocking anybody. But if you had that, where you presented a different option that ultimately ends up with the same thing, that would have been a lot more compelling, because then you would actually have to think through, like, whoa, is this the right thing to do? Rather than, like, obviously doing the Hunger Games again is the wrong thing to do. It's so obvious.
Well, but like, I'm not sure it is, Casey. Okay. Here's the thing, though. If they put them all, if they're like, you're going to go live in a, like, enclosed space with slave labor. So we've already seen, like, that's what the districts have been, right? That is what the districts are. That is, if they're enslaved, that's what the AVOXs are, right? This is happening on a broad scale to the entire population of the capital. Is that, I feel like the Hunger Games, part of the reason why the Hunger Games are an effective tool is that to some degree they're symbolic. We are taking 24 people per year or children per year. And we're going to make them fight to the death. One will survive, blah, blah, blah. This is to remind the districts, blah, blah. But they're not taking the whole population of the district. You know, they're not doing what they did to, well, supposedly did to District 13 and actually did District 12, which is like destroying the entire population as a reminder. They're just taking a few. So you can be like, well, it's not me. And I feel like similarly, one last Hunger Games, because she's not proposing they do this every year. She's proposing they do it once with specifically not just capital children, but like the children of like the capital leaders. So it's like President Snow's granddaughter. Having one with 24 kids, are people really going to be like, oh, no, definitely not that, and be like, ah, yes, let's stick the entire population of the capital in a concentration camp or something like that. Let's make them all AVOXs. I think it's actually savvy because it's something that like has a relatively low impact on the population. It's 24 people. I feel like maybe even some of the capital people would be like, well, it's not our kids, it's the kids of the leaders, you know, who got us into this mess in the first place. So like even maybe some of them would be okay with it. I think it's savvy. It's not the choice I would make, obviously, but I don't think that you can argue that there were, you know, if she wanted to go the more radical way of like, let's keep the us versus them going longer, and she wanted to like punish the capital, I am not sure that having one last Hunger Games is like just clearly the absolute worst option if she wants to go that route.
It's just the symbolism of the games themselves. It's too much for me to believe that this is a savvy move, because you would be creating an equivalency to the population that you are the new President Snow. As you don't want that image, because you just saw what happened with Snow. It's not gonna end well for you, and I feel really what it comes down to is that the ending is not earned at all. We have not seen enough of Coin to justify this decision of hers in any direction. It's just presented here as a kind of lame way to show that Coin is no different than Snow, because they both do the Hunger Games, and the Hunger Games will never end because none of it matters. So let's just kill Coin. That's what it ultimately comes down to. I can tell we're going to have this fight for the rest of our days, Morgan, about whether this move makes sense or not.
I mean, I think that you're right that it is not earned. Letting her have more time with District 13 people, or even with like people that are rebelling in the districts, letting her see more of their feelings. Like, what if in the scenario I proposed earlier. Like, they end up killing everyone after she gets shot in District 2. And maybe the people are like, yeah, they got what they deserved, like, blah, blah, blah. If you see more of that bloodlust from the districts, if you see it from more people than just Gale, then you're like, okay, so it would make sense why Coin would propose Hunger Games 2.0. The issue is that we don't see Coin leaning more radical, other than she orders the bombing of children, but, like, we don't really see anything leading up to that, you know? We needed that build. We needed to see more of the district's anger. And again, not just from Gale, because Gale's one person. Uh-huh. We need to see it from more people. And then it would have been like, okay, I understand why Coin is coming from. Like, I understand she's trying to appease this bloodlust that's still there, while also moving forward. And if we saw her overall being more on the radical side of things, being more extremist, then it would make sense. So I do agree with you that it is not ultimately built up too well by the narrative. I just don't think it's as stupid of a decision as you are trying to put out there.
That's what I mean, is that I think we're going to fight to the end of time about whether or not it's a stupid decision, because I will always think it's a stupid decision, and you will not. And you know what? That's fine.
I'm fine! Totally fine! I don't know why it's coming out all loud and squeaky, because really, I'm fine.
Here's a segue. You know what is earned? All the discussions between Peeta and Katniss.
I love their convos once he gets back. They're so good. They're great.
What's lovely about it is that we finally cut through the bullshit. Like, we cut through Peeta's nice guy act, and we cut through Katniss's woe is me, why does everybody love me, fall in love with me, and we get just to the nitty gritty of hurt feelings. There's one passage I want to read in particular that I just love so much. Peeta says, I must have loved you a lot. You did, says Katniss. My voice catches and I pretend to cough. And did you love me? He asks. I keep my eyes on the tiled floor. Everyone says I did. Everyone says that's why Snow had you tortured, to break me. That's not an answer, he tells me. I don't know what to think when they show me some of the tapes. In that first arena, it looks like you tried to kill me with those tracker jackers. I was trying to kill all of you, I say. You had me treed. Later, there's a lot of kissing. Didn't seem very genuine on your part. Did you like kissing me? He asks. And then a little bit later. And it was okay with both of us. You kissing the other? He asks. He's talking about Gale at this point. No, it wasn't okay with either of you. But I wasn't asking your permission, I tell him. Peeta laughs again, coldly, dismissively. Well, you're a piece of work, aren't you? Just really digging in the knife at the end there. That is such a good line to end with.
It is really nice, the Peeta and Katniss bits. Partially because we've had nice boy Peeta the first couple of books. We have talked about he's a very nice boy. To Katniss specifically, not overall, because he is in fact a manipulative little but because he no longer has soft Peeta feelings for her. You're right, you get to see him kind of confront her for things in a way that he maybe would not have if he had not been hypnotized. And because he doesn't know what's real and what isn't real, and he honestly has to ask her about how certain events went. Like, she actually has to think about what was real and wasn't real, which was kind of the question with their entire relationship. Because it wasn't real, but then it became more real, but yet it still wasn't real because, you know, they were playing it for the cameras and for the districts and etc. So it's like, there were moments in them that were real, but what were those moments? What was the truth underneath it all? So it's like a very good question for their relationship to have at this point, and a very good thing to make Katniss and Peeta think about. And it also allows them to have like an actual like real conflict between them that isn't just one of them being butthurt at the other, which I think is part of the problem with their relationship in the earlier books, is that they're just kind of sullen at each other when they get mad. And it's a lot more refreshing to just have them have a go at each other. And it actually allows them to air out their issues. So yes, it does feel earned. It feels like a good trajectory for their relationship. And I just wish we had gotten more of it. I wish they had had more real, not real conversations. We do not get enough.
Indeed. The implication is that the way he's talking to her and the way he feels about her, that some of these feelings were there from the beginning, or at least from the moment he realized that Katniss's feelings for him weren't real back in the first book. Which just feels like a very true moment, because I think that's just something we all deal with, that when we don't get what we want or whatever, that we carry some resentment, and that's always kind of down there breeding in our hearts. And I think it also leads to a nice moment with Gale, where Gale is like shocked by how bitter Peeta is to Katniss. And he says something along the lines of like, I'm surprised by how much he hates you. It feels so familiar. And he talks about how he felt the same way when he was watching Katniss and Peeta doing all the kissy, lovey-dovey stuff during the games and during the tours and all that jazz. It's this question of like, what stops that bitterness from taking over? And I feel like with Peeta's character, we have a chance to see him work through that and try to figure out how to be more like himself again, and to really struggle with not just like, obviously he's been brainwashed and tortured and psychologically harmed, and he has to struggle with all of that. But I feel like there's also a part of that is that he has to struggle with the hurt feelings that he's been harboring this entire time, and kind of making sense of them, of like allowing like, yeah, that hurt is real, but his love for Katniss is also real. And it's not just like, when I say they're cutting through the bull, I don't want it to seem like, oh, this is just Suzanne Collins f***ing up until this moment. No, I feel like a lot of the bullshit has been set up within the stories of how the media has painted these two characters. Everything about it was artificial, and they never really had an opportunity to delve into those feelings and really figure out for themselves what's real and what's not.
There's a reason that, as the years have gone on, I have become more and more a Katniss Peeta stan. I do think that the build and trajectory of their relationship is very well done, and is tied in well with the themes of the series as well. It's good, and I approve. There should have been more. I feel like in that same more character-driven book about like Katniss and her PTSD and being forced to be the figurehead of a rebellion without like actually getting any input or whatever, there's more slow character work of the two of them rebuilding their relationship with the real or not real game. I feel like this is part of the same book that is, this book is only like half of. There are two good books in this book. We got half of each one, and they don't go very well with each other.
Indeed.
I think the book is okay. I want to put it out there that, like, I am agreeing with many of your negative opinions, but I do think the book is okay. I just think it is by far the weakest of the three, and really could have been a lot better. It's like, I don't know, 3-star, 2.75 star book.
Uh-huh.
I just wanted to establish that.
Oh, fair enough. Yes, this book is easily a 1-star for me. I don't know. I think part of it is that the expectations were lifted so high with the second book. The second book is a strong 4 out of 5. It's nearly a 5 out of 5 if it weren't for the fact that I didn't really care for the second book's version of the Hunger Games. But it is a strong 4 out of 5. And I think I gave the Hunger Games a 2 out of 5. Like, it's a solid 2 out of 5. And if it had been another Hunger Games, in terms of quality, in terms of like, if it had been more action oriented or whatever, Like, that would have been a disappointment because I would have wanted to see more, but it's fine. I just feel like Collins took a big swing and she had a big old miss, and I just feel like part of it, and that's, I mean, what I felt like is that this book didn't really know what it wanted to do, and I like that point you made, that it feels like two different books. And the message comes across, it's so garbled. It's trying to accomplish two things at once. Like, if you have the big, heady, political type book, I don't think Katniss and Peeta working out makes sense in that, because you just wouldn't necessarily have room for that, because Katniss would be too busy doing political or working within this political system, trying to navigate it and figure it out. If you have the more character-centric story, then it totally works, but you can't, it's like really hard to tackle this idea of like the rebels are just as bad, because we see what happens. It's absolutely not earned. Not enough work is done to show why the rebels are just as bad as the Capitol. And like there are so many moments. There's another moment that stuck with me at the end when they're in the streets of the Capitol, and at this point our heroes have disguised themselves and they're trying to get to the mansion, and suddenly there's an attack in this street, and it's just chaos, and there's gunfire everywhere, and there's this one girl, and this is actually a very effective thing that Collins does in this moment, where before there's this little girl that's looking at Katniss, and Katniss thinks that the girl has recognized her, and she says to Gale, "We have to get out of here. We have to book it. I think I've been recognized or spotted or whatever," which casts this little girl as the enemy. She's going to be an informant, and you start to think of her as the enemy. Then suddenly this battle happens, and you see the girl like brutally, you see the girl get shot. It doesn't happen off screen. You see it explicitly happen. And suddenly this person that you were primed just a second ago to see as an enemy is just another victim. So what I wish had happened is if we had that scene in the first third of the book, if you had started the book off by like saying like District 13 are the good guys. Their ways are a little strange and weird to us, but there is no doubt that they are the good guys. And then you almost immediately juxtapose that idea with that scene. And, you know, Collins loves using little girls to create her sympathetic points. But besides that, I think that scene would have been so much more impactful, where suddenly Katniss would be confronted with the brutality of this war, the brutality of what's being asked of her and everyone else involved in this rebellion effort. And it would give some weight to her resisting against the resistance. It would give some weight to this idea that, hey, maybe we shouldn't just buy into the message of District 13. Maybe we should push back a little bit, be a bit more vigilant about what's happening here, and make sure that we're trying to do the right thing where we can't, like, obviously this is war. You can't escape the brutality of it, but that doesn't mean you have to stoop to the level of the Capitol. And I think if that had been presented more consistently and presented earlier on and shown to us rather than told to us, then it would have resonated by the end so much more when she makes the decision to kill Coin. Because it's like, yeah, then we feel like that's the only choice she has at that moment.
Yes, I think that she really needed to pick a theme and really hammer it home.
Which is a shame, because that's what she did with the first two books.
Alas. I still think that, like, on the whole, if I look at the whole trilogy together, I still feel like it's a worthy read. And I do like, because I understand what she was aiming for and I can see it, I like the ending. I agree that it is not properly built up to, and it's not the payoff it should be, but I do theoretically like it and therefore appreciate the trilogy as a whole. I also do wonder, to be fair, I have in the interim between my original reading of these books and my now reading seen the movies, which I think are quite good. So I do wonder how much, and they split Mockingjay into 2 movies. So we really got to sit with it for a lot more time. And so I wonder how much of my fond feelings are somewhat influenced by the movies and how good a job they did or did not do. I feel like the movies were less strong on certain points. Like, I don't think the movies were as strong. You talked about in the previous book in terms of like, I mean, most of the Katniss and Peeta stuff I don't think was as strong, like thinking about like with the media stuff and like, because you're not in her head, you don't see as much of her conflict about like the real, not realness of it all. So I do think that stuff is less strong, but I know for a fact Coin had more time on screen, more dialogue. I feel like, maybe more time was spent, and therefore that in some ways I feel like the ending was justified in the book, partially because I have the movie in the back of my mind, but I'm never rewatching the Mockingjay movies, so I cannot actually test that theory. But listeners, if you have thoughts, let us know. Am I just mentally inserting the movies? Who knows?
I can totally see that if you've seen the movies, because there's no way you can have a character like Coin as that's presented here in this book. She has almost no screen time in this book, but I know for a fact that she's played by what's her face, some famous actress, and it's like, you're gonna use her.
Julianne Moore?
I think so, yeah. She's gonna add something to that role that is not present at all in the book. It is funny to me that like the media aspect doesn't live up to the books in that way, but that kind of makes sense to me because you're having all these characters played by hot Hollywood actors. That in and of itself plays into the mess. I don't know. It's Hollywood.
Yes, there's often a comment among the Hunger Games fandom online that the movies. Okay, so the books. The Gale Peeta love triangle absolutely exists within the books. Yes. But the movies do to it what the media in the Hunger Games did to Katniss and Peeta, basically. They're like, oh yeah, who will she pick? Team Peeta, Team Gale. And it's very much that commercialization of the romance, because this was the post-Twilight phase, so everything had to be Team X or Team Y. And so the actual romance, as is clearly evidenced, is not the fucking point of the Hunger Games, the series. And yes, the love triangle is there. The love triangle is mostly there as a metaphor for the 2 options. And like the romance is not the point, and therefore is mostly non-existent, I would argue, until the end of the second book. It's just not actually there until then, I would say. For me, the real not real begins during the second Hunger Games.
Right. And it's almost like, this is probably going to sound very silly, but it kind of goes back to the sort of heteronormative aspect that you were talking about in this book, to have that love triangle be a love triangle. Because it's not like, it doesn't really feel like a competition. She is capable of loving both of these people. The idea of choosing one or the other feels like a false choice. I mean, okay, yes, I'm not saying that like they're going to enter a polyamorous relationship between the 3 of them or anything like that. But I'm just saying that it doesn't feel like, the choice feels like a false one, because it's not like she chooses Peeta and Gale is forgotten to the winds. It feels like everything that happens with Gale and Katniss is a completely separate story. But like, that's part of why I hate the fact that Gale and Peeta have that conversation at the end about who Katniss is going to choose, that part leaned into the love triangle aspect way too hard that I just don't think is really deserved or warranted by the book.
Well, and I can tell you exactly why that conversation happened. Because Suzanne wanted that line from Gale about Katniss choosing who she won't be able to survive without. Because, yeah, it did not need to be there at all. It's a bad scene. Like, I give Suzanne a lot of room. I am not one to really normally be like, this is just straight up bad. The cat game metaphor is straight up bad. That scene between Gale and Peeta is straight up bad. Well, especially because, like, at the time she was writing this, Breaking Dawn, or Eclipse had been out a while, she absolutely, if Suzanne Collins did not know about the scene with Edward and Jacob, which, I mean, I guess it's possible she didn't. But, like, it is so clearly like that scene that it draws comparisons. And I'm going to side detour for a second into Twilight Land just to say, yeah, I agree with you. The whole solution to the love triangle is person has two hands. Does not work in this situation. Gale and Peeta are fundamentally incompatible, and that's part of the point. And I kind of like that we mostly don't see them interact. I think that's correct. I think they should be, like you said, two separate worlds for Katniss. I would disagree with you in that I don't think they can exist at once, and I think that's part of the point, that it is two separate worlds that she has to pick a world. Side detour into Eclipse Land, that part of the reason why that scene also doesn't work is because Peeta and Gale are so fundamentally incompatible and therefore have no chemistry. I don't mean even in a romantic sense. I mean in a sense that, like, they do not sound correct speaking to each other. You don't want to hear them exchange words. It feels bad. Unlike Eclipse, the Edward and Jacob scene is actually terrific because they have a great dynamic that is further expounded on in Breaking Dawn. And I'm sorry, Edward and Jacob and Bella absolutely should have all three gotten together. And that was the correct solution to that love triangle. You don't understand. Edward and Jacob have this convo, and you're like, holy Edward and Jacob should like, that's what happens. I don't know what to tell you. So I feel like this scene feels even worse when you're thinking about that scene and you're like, that is one of the best scenes in Eclipse, is Edward and Jacob talking. Because in that scene in Eclipse, part of what they do is they agree to just be absolutely honest and straight with each other. And, like, it's like what you were talking about with Katniss and Peeta, where it's like all the bullshit is down. Bella's asleep. They're being totally brutally honest to how badly they're trying to manipulate her. And they're vibing. It's a great scene. It's a fantastic scene. Peeta and Gale, there's, like, one, they have, like, nothing to say to each other, really. Like, there's just nothing for them to really say other than, like, we're competing for the same girl, but they already knew that, so why would they talk about it? Like, I just don't see them having that convo. And then it's just to get in this line about who she can't survive without, which, to be fair, is a Katniss line. I don't mind the idea that she picks who she can survive without in terms of, like, in the sense that it ends up meaning, because she brings it back as in, like, who can I survive as a person? Like, who can I, instead of, like, this nihilistic worldview that we kind of see where nothing matters, who can I, like, live with?
Mm-hmm.
Who makes me live? And I don't mind that end result, but I wish it had gotten worked in like, literally any other way than that convo.
Yeah, like, realistically, that conversation... Well, actually, first, let me just say, what you've described with Bella, Edward, and Jacob, another reason why that threesome works is because it just hits so many different kinks. What kinks are served by a Katniss, Peeta, and Gale thruple situation? Nothing. It's doing nothing for me. But realistically, if Peeta and Gale were to have a conversation like that, it would be... This would also be stupid, but the only version I could see of it existing is if they were like, look, there's a very good chance that one of us is not going to make it out of this alive. There's a very good chance none of us will make it out of this alive. But whoever does make it out of alive, I want you to be happy with Katniss. she needs us, basically. Something along that lines. It'd be super corny. It'd be super dumb. But at least it'd be better than what we get.
I also feel like I wonder why it has to be a love triangle. Like, why can't it just be she's torn between two different guys, but one of them she's not? What if Gale actually just was her cousin? Like, obviously, then there's not the, like, who am I going into the future with? But to be fair, you can pick your family and just have a platonic continued existence with your family, too. So, like, you could have a lot of the same conflicts and not have it be a love triangle. Some effectiveness is added in terms of, like, yes, she is choosing who she wishes to pair off with for her heteronormative future. Mm-hmm. But I do think there's a way to do it without it being that. And since, as we've established, romantic writing is not Suzanne Collins' strong point, that might have been more effective. But, yeah, I mean, overall, I other than obviously the annoying scene where Peeta and Gale speak to each other, which they should never do, I'm not mad about the resolution of the whole Gale-Peeta situation in the end.
It certainly makes sense, I think. Especially with Gale, like, the loss there, it doesn't feel like a romantic loss. It feels like a loss of a friendship. And to me, that's a lot more significant. Obviously, romantic loss hurts a lot and all that jazz, but losing a friend, losing a best friend is, I would argue, just as painful. I feel like that should have been the direction with Gale. Maybe they could have had they could still have, like, their moments of romance in the second book, but they kind of realize, oh, it really would have never worked out. It is possible for people to have crush feelings on somebody else, have it not work out for whatever reason, or be rejected, and still to be wonderful companions.
Or there could just be, like, the underlying vibes that they kind of assumed one day they would get together. But there was no need for anything to surface about that.
Yeah.
It is not necessary. We don't need them kissing. At no point is the kissing necessary, other than it gets us that great line you read out where Peeta's like, really? We were both cool with that?
I mean, I don't mind the kissing, because I do think that's... Because one great thing about the quote-unquote romance in the first and second book is that it's not just romance for the sake of romance. It's adding to our sense of Katniss's character and the confusion that she's dealing with in regards to her feelings, in regards to her role. I don't mind it in that regard. I think it's great, actually, to have that moment where Gale kisses Katniss in the forest. It lends weight to President Snow's threat against Gale, because that just adds to confusion, because Snow is threatening Gale because he thinks Gale is a romantic interest for Katniss, which perhaps for Katniss, if she feels like that's the reason why, maybe then it reinforces, oh, maybe these feelings I have for him are romantic in nature. And it just adds to her sense of just utter sheer confusion. Like, I love it for that. Making it into a focal point in this book that, no, this is actually a love triangle and she has to choose. Feels like it's it's missing the point of this entire series. Like, it's nothing about this is romantic. Katniss ending up with Peeta, I mean, it's romantic, but it doesn't really feel romantic. It feels more like a resignation. This is more about the companionship he offers to her, rather than like, oh, I'm so passionately in love with him. So just like having it be a competition suddenly now. Just,
Honestly, I feel like the whole thing could have been solved by just taking that scene out.
That could have been the solution for many scenes in this book.
Just take the scene out.
just take it out.
Add in another round of real, not real. Just keep stuffing those in. I will say, I know it's cheesy as but I love that the like end conclusion. So we get like, you know, time lapse Peeta and Katniss falling in love, quote unquote, but more like growing together, I feel like, into a love that is romantic but is also very companion in nature. But I do love that it ends with Peeta being like, you love me, real or not real. Katniss is like, real. I think it's cute.
It made me scream with rage.
I know, because that's exactly the sort of bullshit you don't like, but I feel like in certain doses, I think it's well-deserved and fun. And I think in that particular dose, it's well-deserved and fun.
Look, I mean, I'm not against cutesy endings like that. I mean, Love in the Time of Cholera is one of my favorite books ever. And it has a very kind of similar ending line in that it's a very, like, super dramatic, like, yes, I love you kind of thing. And I love that moment. I just hate it here.
I don't, but I see that's the thing. I don't think it's dramatic. Because, I mean, like, yes, it is. It's cheesy, I will say. I think it's cheesy. But I think that's different because, like, the whole point is that it's not a big deal. It's that he turns to her one day and he's like, you love me, real or not real? She says, real. So it's just, like, more that, like, this was something that had slowly grown for them, as we are told.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's not this big, like, giant love confession. It's just that one day, like, he knows that she loves him and just asks for that, like, verbal confirmation. And I like that for them. I think it's cute. I also think it's a good sign that they continued communicating openly. And I think they probably continued using the real, not real system for many things in their lives. And I think that's good for them because they clearly have communication issues. So I'm happy that this solved this for them.
I love that's the takeaway from this. Oh, at least they're communicating.
They are.
I know,
They
I know what you're saying, but it is just kind of funny. Like, oh, at least, they had to be tortured and suffer horrifically along the way, but at least they learned how to talk to each other.
That's what it takes with 17-year-olds.
I cannot think of a better way to end this. So let's just end this.
Okay.
Thank you for listening. Until next time, hasta la vista.
Bye-bye.
You love me. Are you playing your love games with me? I just wanna know what to do, cause I need your love a lot. Come on now.